Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's SaferSim webinar. My name is Jacob Hayden, and I'm the program coordinator for SaferSim at the University of Iowa. Safety Research Using Simulation, or SaferSim, is a Tier 1 university transportation center with the research priority of promoting safety. Our webinar series features the research happening within our center, so thanks for joining us today. There will be time at the end of our presentation for questions and discussion. Attendees can use their microphone or chat box to participate. And feel free to use the chat box at any time throughout the presentation as well. And with that, today's webinar features the UMass portion of collaborative research between SaferSim and the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, which is the team is led by Dr. Bill Horry. But today we are hearing from UMass, and I'm pleased to welcome our presenter, Ganesh Pai.
Thank you for that introduction, Jacob. So, can everyone see my slide fine?
Yep, we can
All right.
see it and hear you.
Thanks, Jacob. So, for this slide, I'll be speaking on behalf of Dr. Bill Horry from the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. The research to be presented right now is a part of the SaferSim AAA FTS Cooperative Research Program, which is a 2-year program with 5 projects currently underway with a joint pursuit of improving traffic safety. The project that I'll be presenting today is the driver's mental model of advanced vehicle technologies, a proposed framework for identifying and predicting operator errors. I would like to first acknowledge all my fellow researchers, Dr. Anuj Pradhan, Dr. Mike Nodler, Dr. Cole Fitzpatrick, all part of UMass, either from the Human Performance Lab or from the UMass Transportation Center, and of course, Dr. Bill Horry from the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. I'd also like to acknowledge several graduate and undergraduate students from UMass, Jaydeep Ravi, both the Saras, as well as Dr. John Gaspar from the University of Iowa and Sher Khani. So as we all know, ADAS is quickly taking over, and advanced driver assistance systems are featured more and more in everyday vehicles, helping drivers to perform better in terms of longitudinal performance and lateral performance, adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistant, traffic jam assist, forward collision systems being a few prominent systems featured in today's vehicles. Now, these systems have an overall goal of improving roadway safety by decreasing traffic congestion and also alerting drivers about potential crash events, and also preventing conflicts and crashes on the roadway. But with these ADAS systems, with the introduction of these systems, there are several human factors challenges that pop up, and some of them are visualized here. But to name a few, mode confusion is one of the human factors challenges, where the driver is confused about what mode they're driving in or what the system is currently doing and whether they need to intervene or not. Lack of pre-usage training practices can prevent drivers from having a better understanding about how to use the system or optimally intervene or control the system, as well as gaps in mental models, which can prevent them from understanding when the system has reached its limitations and when they would need to be in the loop. And now all these human factors challenges will ultimately lead or may lead to drivers committing errors. Now, in the NHTSA report by Singh 2015, driver errors were assigned as a critical reason in 94% of the crashes. Now, I know this report was somewhat controversial, but I believe the findings were kind of misinterpreted by lots of folks in terms of the term critical reasoning. The critical reasoning by Singh was mentioned as the last event in the causal chain leading up to crashes. And Singh mentioned that in these critical reasons, recognition errors accounted for 41% of the crashes, while decision-making and performance errors led to 33 and 11% of the errors respectively, crashes respectively. Now, one of the probable reasons for driver errors, as mentioned earlier, could be gaps or deficits in a person's mental models. Now, what is mental model exactly? It's a very abstract concept that has been described and defined by various researchers in different studies in the past. But in general, it could reflect a user's understanding about a system's functions, what causes those functions, and what actions are required to cause those functions. And a user's mental model is a continuously updating network which updates every time a driver experiences a particular event, and then they store their experience into a long-term memory which they will retain in future similar or similar or the exact same situations to respond and mitigate those situations. Now, for mental models, it's pretty evident that a driver needs to have knowledge about how a system works. So mental models are dictated by a driver's knowledge. But what happens when the users lack the knowledge altogether? In past studies, particularly Ganesh from 2008, showed that out of 370 ACC users, 259 were unaware about ACC limitations and functions, while Mellenbacher in 2002 said that 60% of the drivers read only half of the owner's manual, while 40% did not read the owner's manual at all. Now, this lack of understanding of system's functionalities or lack of regard of reading for reading owner's manual could result in absence of an initial mental model, which is required for a driver to initially get used to their new system or to optimally use it right from the start. It could also lead to them overestimating or misusing the vehicle's functions and also causing trust and reliance issues where they may overtrust the cars because they overestimated its functions or did not know its limitations or mistrusted the car and did not use the systems altogether. Singer and Jenis, another AAA FTS study in 2020, explored ways in which instructional quality from owner's manual affected drivers' interaction and expectations with the system. And they mentioned that framing and instructional qualities of these manuals could have negative effects on how owners perceive their systems. And it is important for manufacturers to produce enough information about limitations, as well as make it clear that driver engagement is vital while using ADAS systems. While mental models are abstract concepts that cannot be quantified and measured directly, one of the surrogate measures that we can quantify and measure them is through identifying and classifying driver errors. Now, identifying and classifying driver errors can help us characterize mental models based on the completeness of one's mental model as well as accuracy. Now, these two terms can be best illustrated through an example. So let's say you're using the touchpad of your laptop. Now, you know that the touchpad is a substitute for your mouse, and there are many gestures that you can do on your touchpad that could elicit many uh, responses, such as a three-finger gesture can change your music, for example. Now, knowing all that, having the knowledge about that is defined as completeness of a mental model, while knowing what exactly each gesture and each touch on the touchpad does is known as accuracy. In the past, several researchers have tried to classify errors. Rasmussen in 1988 classified them as skill-based, rule-based, and knowledge-based errors, while Reason classified them as slips, lapses, mistakes, and violations. While Stanton and Salmon in 2009 produced a comprehensive taxonomy of psychological mechanism-based errors. I'll dive into that a little bit more. So they classified errors into action errors, cognitive and decision-making errors, observation errors, information retrieval errors, and violations. But this taxonomy required a continuous observation for a task-dependent activity from a driver, which was usually done by utilizing task analysis techniques. Now, various task analysis techniques have been used in the past, such as GOMS, which is goals, operators, measurements, and systems, and Concord trees, and also hierarchical task analysis. These have been used to look at user behavior, user errors, and also find out remedies for various human factors challenges and testing and usability testing solutions. While HTA techniques have been used more prominently, and among them, systematic human error reduction and prediction approach, Sherpa, and task analysis for error identification, TAFI, have been very prominently featured. And they have also utilized some of the error taxonomies that we saw earlier. So the objective of a framework, the objective of the study is to propose a framework for identifying and predicting operator errors when using ADAS features. And to do this, we will first visualize an ADAS feature, that is, we have chosen adaptive cruise control, and then we'll define various functions of the adaptive cruise control system into several finite states. Now, this is important because for a task analysis, we'll need finite states where a user can go through all the states through different transitions. Next, we will understand the transitions between these states, and then we will understand and identify actions required by the users to transition between those states, which could elicit errors. Next, we'll brainstorm reasons for occurrence of those identified errors. And then lastly, we'll classify the errors in terms of error types and error modes by utilizing appropriate error taxonomies from the literature. Now, what you see before you is a state diagram. Now, a state diagram is a great visualization technique which can be used to visualize a complex system in an easy to understand manner. The state diagram you see before you is a typical ACC system. This was put together by our team of researchers at UMass by reading through different owners' manual and to come up with different states and transitions, as well as tasks and subtasks to visualize an ACC system and in an easy to understand manner. Now, why we need ACC system? Why do we need state diagrams? Is because ACC is a complex system, as I've mentioned multiple times so far, and each state will be required to be represented has a unique condition along with a unique function. As I mentioned before, task analysis requires a finite state machine, and this helps us do so. Now, among the states that we recognize for a typical ACC system, these 5 were common for almost all of our ACC systems that we reviewed. State 0 is ACC is not switched on. State 1 is ACC switched on but not engaged. State 2 is ACC is engaged with no lead vehicle and the ACC is functioning with just the speed setting set by the user. State 3 is where ACC is engaged with a lead vehicle. That means the speed is regulated in accordance with the lead vehicle and the distance is set by the user. As well as lastly, state 4, which is ACC is temporarily disengaged. Now, this is primarily done by pressing the gas pedal in order to pass or to exit through a highway. And some of the nomenclatures that I want to make sure that everyone understands is what are states? States are basically represented in the circles. We see 5 states there. Transitions are represented by the arrows, transitions between the states. And the task, which is the unique function of each state, is the text within the circles. Now, the subtasks are the conditions or the user initiated actions that result in a transition between the states. Now, for the subtask to be carried out, there are typical ACC controls such as brakes, gas pedals, the ACC on-off button, rest plus button, the set minus button, the distance plus or minus button, and the cancel button. And when a user performs an action through one of these controls, a transition may or may not occur based on our transition matrix, which lets us know of what transition is possible and what transition is not possible. Now, this is one of the most commonly featured elements in task analysis techniques, a transition matrix. Now, here you see state 0 and 0, it's NP, which means it's not possible. Now, state 0 to state 1 says L, which stands for legal, but it generally means a possible transition. Now, we take all of these legal or possible transitions, and then we list them in this table here. Now, there are 17 possible transitions for a typical ACC system. Now, on the last column, you see a subtask, which comprises of the various user-initiated tasks that will result in a transition. But you can also recognize the fact that, for example, for number 3, there are about 3 different user-initiated tasks possible for the transition to occur. So now that means not only there are 17 different transitions, there are multiple ways to transition for each of those 17 transitions, which means that the possibility of driver error just increases as a person operates an ACC system, which could lead to undesired outcomes. Now, these driver errors could be due to false assumptions, could be due to lack of knowledge, and could even be slips that the driver unintentionally performed. And errors in general can, as mentioned earlier, shed a light into the gaps and misconception of a driver's mental model. So for the error identification and classification process, our group at UMass conducted an extensive human factors literature regarding ADAS systems, regarding ACC systems, and then applied our understanding of ACC operations to look at different error modes and error types using a taxonomy adapted from Stanton and Salmon in 2009. Now, using this taxonomy, we can classify the errors in not only as error types, that is action errors, cognitive errors, observation errors, and information retrieval errors, but we can also look at individual mode of each of those error types. So to make things simpler, let's take an example and let's consider the transition from state 0 to state 1. Now the task or the function that is met at state 1 is switching on of the ACC. Now the subtask required for that transition to happen is for the driver or the user to press the ACC on-off button. Now the incorrect actions here could be if the driver presses rest plus, set minus, cancel, the distance plus or minus buttons. But the brake and gas pedals are not considered as incorrect actions here. Because why? Because state 0 is basically manual driving, and brake and gas pedals are pretty vital to the active driving task. But pressing rest plus, set minus, cancel, and distance plus or minus is not accurate for either the active driving task in manual driving or at state 1 when the ACC is not engaged yet. So then let's consider one of those activities. Let's consider the driver pressed rest plus button instead of the ACC on and off button. And then our team sat down and brainstormed the reasonings of why a driver could possibly press the rest plus button instead of the ACC on and off button. And we found out that there could be 4 reasons. It could either be that the driver thought the rest plus turns on the ACC. It could be that the driver assumed the speed and assumed speed had to be set before switching on the ACC, or they unintentionally pressed rest plus, basically bumped it, or they unintentionally pressed rest plus, thinking they're pushing on and off. And now for these various reasonings, we have different error types and error modes. For example, for driver thought rest plus turns ACC, it could have been an intentional inappropriate action, or it could have been a wrong assumption based on their cognitive and decision-making error. And through this way, we find out different error types and error modes for each of these reasonings. And as a result, we have a framework that can help us identify errors for all user-initiated subtasks for all transitions. It is also possible to apply this framework to accommodate exclusive features for each manufacturers, as well as different ADAS features. It could also be expanded to understand the interactions of the driver with the user interface in the vehicle, which is nowadays pretty vital to an operation of an ADAS system, since it tells you what mode the ADAS is currently functioning in. It helps us identify errors to deficits and gaps in mental models. And it could also shape empirical experiments to observe driver behaviors and errors by providing us with a framework, a path, in order to understand the driver behaviors, as well as help us identify the best dependent variables to measure those behaviors. With state diagrams, we get a great visualization method to understand these systems. And to be honest, state diagrams can also be looked at by a layperson, and they could understand how the ACC is working, provided they look at it enough. Uh, we also compile multiple state diagrams from multiple different manufacturers and models, and we found out that most systems have similar constructs. And while doing so, this also yielded a secondary outcome. So the secondary outcome was that we looked at the reporting of system limitation across makes and models. Now, to give a little background again, we mentioned before that initial knowledge is pretty vital for initial formation of a model and its subsequent development. And an owner's manual does not inform users well about the limitations and functionalities of ADAS systems as shown by Singer and Jenis in 2020. And there's a stark variance in the level of details and completeness provided in the owner's manual. So what we did while doing our state diagrams was we listed 10 manufacturers and their best-selling models in 2018. And while doing so, as said earlier, we reviewed the entire owner's manual to understand and examine the performance limitations and functionalities of each of these ACC systems. And while doing so, we also gave keywords to each of the limitations that we listed. And it resulted in the 18 limitations that you see in the table to your right. And this was combined and sorted among all the manufacturers and models with their exclusive features weaned out. And by doing so, we got a count of how many limitations were reported by each manufacturers and how well they reported their limitations. And from this table, you can see that there's a stark variance between how manufacturers report their limitations as well as their number. Basically, you can see that Subaru reported 35 limitations for their ACC system, while Mazda reported only 13. But does this mean that Mazda is better than Subaru? Of course not. It may mean that Subaru may be doing a better job at reporting their limitations, but that is again subjective. We don't know that yet, whether reporting more limitations is better for a user or not. But we know that there is a difference now in the way or the number of limitations reported by each manufacturer. And from that, we come to our overall conclusion where a proposed framework can be used to identify driver errors. And we also reiterated the fact that manufacturers are not consistent in the details and limitations reported. Our work in general can be helped to develop experimental scenarios for empirical testing, because now we have a comprehensive list of scenarios from those 18 categories that we can build up. The possibilities are basically endless with those categories. And this can also help us promote human-centered design in vehicles, and manufacturers can take note of how they can improve on their design. This can also help shape educational and training practices for improving the knowledge for users when using these systems. And with that, I come to the end of this presentation, and I'll be happy to receive questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ganesh. As you mentioned, we do have time for questions and comments. We are using Zoom. If attendees would prefer to use their mic, you can unmute yourself, or feel free to use the chat box. Okay. I'm not seeing anything right now, so we'll give it a little bit longer. I do want to include a couple links here. So as we've mentioned, this is part of collaborative research between our center SaferSim and the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. So that first link I included is a link to a final report that's from the University of Iowa and AAA. And that's kind of part of the same project that Ganesh discussed today. I do also want to include, if that report link doesn't interest you, we do have a link to the webinar presentation on that other project. We will have a YouTube link for this presentation today that we'll send to everyone once it's available.
Ganesh, this is David Yang from AAA Foundation. Thank you for the presentation. I think, for me, I was very interested earlier, Ganesh, you showed that chart of the different car manufacturer that has basically different kind of limitation, identify limitation. Did you or any other have any conversation with any of these OEM, kind of sharing about these, about your research findings so far?
No, I don't think so, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, because I kind of wonder, just kind of, and again, that we can have additional discussion in the future. I kind of wonder too is that if somehow down the road a conversation with some of these car manufacturer will be could be very helpful, because they may have additional perspective from their own vehicles that they can provide information that we may not know of, kind of more looking from the outside. So,
Yeah, we haven't had that conversation yet, but we want to include more manufacturers somewhere down the line. It was basically a secondary outcome, so we didn't have a chance to look at it a little more.
okay.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting option to explore. And I think, from Safer Sim's perspective, that's definitely what we want out of the research is, what else, how can people use that and implement it into their work or, other things like that. So with that, I think I'm not seeing any more questions. I will get a pitch here for Safer Sim's final webinar of 2020. That will be on Tuesday, November 10th, and that is featuring research from the Hank Virtual Environments Lab, which is the multidisciplinary bicycling and pedestrian simulator at the University of Iowa. So if you're interested in that, we will be sending out information, and there is a registration link in your chat box as well. But again, I'd like to thank our presenter today and really thank everyone involved in this collaborative research. I think this research is important, and it's important that we're able to understand what these technologies are doing, so we can kind of see that benefit from it. So again, we'll share this link once it's available. We'll also include the link to the final report once that's available, as Pi mentioned. And I'll turn it over to you for any final thoughts, Ganesh.
No, it's all good from my end, Jacob. Thank you so much for letting me present. And
Excellent, thank you. Well, thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.